Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Astrology Hub podcast. I am so happy that you've decided to join us here today. I have a very special guest with us, Adam Sommer. We have been featuring Adam's work almost from the beginning of Astrology Hub. He's one of the astrologers that right from the start, I just resonated with everything that he said and continue to resonate with both his approach to astrology, but also the way he communicates about astrology. It's very unique. It's very soulful, and it's just very mercurial for me. And I just love it. So Adam is here. He has been practicing astrology for 16 years. He started his own astrology podcast 15 years ago, maybe the longest standing astrology podcast on air. I'm not totally sure about that. Maybe?
It's a toss up between Gary and I.
Gary. Okay. All right. Interesting. Gary Caton?
Yeah. We started at the same time. It was in spring of 2009.
Nice.
And I think there was actually another one too, but we've talked about that one before.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. And then 14 years of teaching astrology. He has an awesome, what do you call it? Like a blog or like a Substack? What
Substack.
Substack.
That's the new term. Yeah.
Substack.
Yeah.
Yes. And I absolutely love the way you write, Adam. It's just so good. It's so creative. It's so different. And I love it. And so today we have Adam here to talk about a couple of his favorite topics. And I need to say one more thing. Adam and I tend to have podcast episodes when things are especially intense or almost like right before or as they're becoming intense, we somehow wind up having conversations. And one of the ones I remember so distinctly was right in the beginning of 2020. It was, I think, March of 2020, and things were starting to get really weird in the world. And I invited Adam on. I was like, Adam, what's happening? Like, what do you think? What's going on? And we had just such a beautiful conversation then that helped to anchor me and a lot of our community in the astrological invitation of the time. So today we're going to be talking about the eclipses, the eclipse season that we're currently in. We're going to be talking about the Mars retrograde that is going to be officially starting in December and going into February of 2025, although the shadow of that Mars retrograde is a lot bigger of a window, October 4th to May 2nd. And then I'm going to ask Adam to give us his read on 2025 and 2026. And whether or not he agrees with some of the astrologers we've had on this show recently who've said the astrology is even bigger than what we experienced in 2020. Adam, welcome to the show. I'm so happy you're here.
Well, so am I. Thank you for that sweet intro.
You're welcome.
Kind words.
Yes. All right. So let's start with the eclipses. Actually, before we do that, I don't think we've ever told your story of how you came to astrology. And I'm fascinated and I'd love to learn. So what brought you to astrology, and especially the type of astrology that you like to study and teach and practice today?
How to tell this story differently this time? Let's see. For starters, I'm definitely an accidental astrologer in the sense that I'd already kind of been on a bit of a path predating astrology. Like I had gone to Naropa, I had been practicing Buddhism, I had been to a few different jungles doing interesting things. I was at acupuncture school. I was already involved in a lot of the healing arts, I suppose. And I was never interested in astrology. Of course, I had rubbed up against it a lot, but it just wasn't something that I was into. And the way I'll tell the story this time is I really do think that Bob Dylan was my intro. And it's such a simple story in the sense that when I was like 19 years old, and so the way I'll tell it this time is like I didn't start studying astrology immediately after what I'm about to share, but it was the first thing that like kind of kicked a little door open in my mind. And, have you ever played around with that birthday book? Like the big fat table book? Okay.
Yes.
So my friend had it on her coffee table in college. And one night we're all like hanging out at her house and like I pull it to my birthday. and I see Dylan's face in the margins of the day, right? And it kind of like struck me hard in that moment because I was in this phase of like really obsessing on Bob Dylan. In fact, I was like systematically listening to all of his albums, reading the lyrics. His book Chronicles had just come out. For all you Dylan fans out there, you know the time scale. This is probably like 2002 or three. And I was just obsessed. And to learn that we had the same birthday was really interesting to me. And so like I read all about the day and some of the features of what it means to be born on May 24th and stuff like that. And it was intriguing. I'm like, how in the world can they get all this information just from knowing the day? You know, because even now, looking back on it, I have reread that as an astrologer, and I still don't fully know like what they're going off of because
Wow.
for example, you can't use symbol systems fully because like in the case for Dylan versus myself, like my son's 2 Gemini, his is 3. And so you can't be using Sabians or Chandra or you know what I mean, any of that stuff.
Right.
And so it's just maybe like more grounded in numerology or
Right.
something else. Like I don't know, but like all that matters is that like something kind of like lifted my eyebrow
Hmm.
about it, you know? And I've never listened to Dylan since without thinking like there's a 2-degree, 3-degree Gemini thing going on here, you know?
Wow.
Like why
Wow.
people love him is what has always driven me within all of my artistic pursuits. Like you said, mercurial. We're ruled by Mercury. And so like any wordsmith, whether it's a
Yeah.
singer, songwriter, a poet, or writer, it doesn't matter. It's like I recognize something in what they're doing that speaks directly to soul. And I want to do that. I've always wanted to do that. Right. And he's just one of the best that's ever been able to do that with a guitar, you know?
Yeah.
And so, anyways, like years went by after that. And then it was actually when I was in acupuncture school, and this is how I usually tell the story, was Richard Tarnas had released Cosmos and Psyche. And so I was just reading that book for leisure while I was in school. And didn't even really know it was an astrology book either. Like I was interested in it because he had written Passion of the Western Mind, which was a textbook we used in college. And I liked it. And so this was the second book. I bought it. And then I realized I was reading an astrology book after a little bit of time with it. I'm like, okay, I'll keep going. Like so much of it was over my head, but it was intriguing. I enjoyed it. And then from there, I just basically started meeting a lot of astrologers. And you've had Ari on, right? Ari Moshe?
Yes. Yes. We love Ari.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we briefly lived together in Olympia, Washington. And it was in that small little chapter of my life where, you know, just like constantly talking about astrology with him, having exchanged our services and stuff like that, becoming friends. I realized like I think astrology will be really useful in what I'm doing. At the time I was doing medical Qigong. And so, yeah, just taking in mainly evolutionary astrology at that point. But, you know, I had fast tracked a good amount of information into my mind to where like I was using it in my practice. And then it happened very organically. People started asking me if I did readings. And I was like, no, but I'll try. We can look at your chart together, kind of a thing. And then after doing that, I realized I actually enjoyed giving readings. I liked the whole process about it. I thought it was such an interesting way of connecting to a person.
Wow.
And when I moved out, I moved back to Colorado from Washington. And it just kind of dropped in my head one day. It was very impulsive, actually. I was biking across town and I had this thought of like, what happens if I go and get a microphone from Best Buy right now and start a podcast? Like it was kind of like that. And so
Wow.
I did it. It was in the spring of 2009. And I started 3 different shows at the same time just to kind of like just to test it to see like what will work here. So I started one on Chinese medicine. I started one on music, which was me both sharing music I love and kind of like being a DJ of sorts, like a jockey, but just
Uh-huh.
like sharing tunes and just telling stories in between. That one didn't work out. And then the astrology one. And almost instantly, people were listening to the astrology podcast. And I actually almost named it that too. Chris knows
Oh,
that story.
whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. But I couldn't. Like, I couldn't because I was too new to the
Mm,
subject.
mm,
And the only thing that felt right at the time was exploring astrology because it's exactly what I was doing.
mm.
And so that's what the name was forever.
And were you interviewing people? Or were you doing solo shows? Like, what were you doing?
The first 10, and so that was another thing. Like I gave myself the goal of doing at least 10 episodes for each of these podcasts, right? And I did do 10 for each. So I think the first 10, there might have been one solo one, but like, no, they were all conversations. And so like, I think the second show was with Stephen Forrest and he was like on an actual telephone, like the sound quality. It was so bad. Couldn't see him. Zoom didn't exist.
Oh, but this is 2009. I mean, the fact that you were even doing
Yeah.
podcasts, I don't even think I knew what podcasts were in 2009.
Not many people did. No,
You've
not until like
always
post 2012.
right. I mean, you've always been ahead of the curve as far as I'm concerned in the different things that you do. It's like you're doing them before most of us even know what they mean or what they are. And it's fascinating to see like what you've been into even in the last few years where it's like it's just hard for people to grasp certain things that you're doing. But I feel like you're just a little bit ahead of the curve.
Like Bitcoin.
Like Bitcoin. Yeah, which I still literally we've had so many conversations and I still don't get it, but I have heard from Ray Merriman recently, the financial astrologer who's like it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. And it was just interesting because I know you have held that line throughout every up and down, every twist and turn. You've been saying the same thing. And so to have, however many years later, Ray Merriman coming on go and saying astrologically, this is here, this is staying, it makes me really want to understand it better. But then it's kind of like, do you have to really understand? Like, do I understand electricity? Not
Or
totally.
the internet.
Or the internet, exactly. Not totally, but I use it. So, I mean, anyways, you're a trendsetter. Okay. So, Adam, what about cycles? Why have you been interested in cycles? Because I know Mercury cycles. We're going to be talking about Mars retrograde, like which is part of a cycle, obviously. What's interesting to you about studying the cycles of the planets, but then also using them in your life in tangible ways? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is that it personalizes the experience in a really profound way. Um, to use an example, because we're going to talk about it, like with the Mars cycle, it's one of the more challenging ones to actually track because it's the longest of the synodic cycles. Like 780 days is a pretty long time to keep your mind remembering that, like, oh, wait, this cycle started all the way back in November of 2023 in Scorpio, and it was in this area of my chart, and these were the themes, and you know what I mean? And like, there's this journey that it goes on, and there's a living sky component of it. There's the journey through your chart, of course. It's a tough one, but if you do have like a theme that it's very much clear at the beginning of any cycle, whether it's Mars, Venus, Mercury, or any of the others. And I really only focus on the personal planets, but you could do this with any of the planets. You will notice that it never goes away. Like that theme is set throughout the whole cycle. And like anything, the more attention you give it, the more it's going to give back. And you can even take a further step. And once you start engaging with the planet, or dare we say God, it too speaks back, shows up in the dreams, shows up with symbols and synchronicity, shows up in all these interesting ways.
Mm.
And so, like I was sharing before we recorded, like it's really the Mercury cycles that are like kind of the core of a lot of my work at the moment, because they're the quickest cycles. They're very easy to teach people. But also, it's like if you can't pay attention for that extended amount of time, don't even try with Venus or Mars. And in a way, like if you can't for a lunar cycle, with like you like start with the lunar cycle,
Right.
what was the theme from new moon to new moon kind of a thing.
Right.
But so yeah, it's just a way of living myth, really.
Well, let me just clarify. So when you're talking about a Mars retrograde cycle, for example, or a Mercury retrograde cycle, or a Mercury retrograde moment, for example, you're saying that there's a starting point of which that retrograde is a part of. And if without the context of the starting point of that
Mm-hmm.
cycle, it's sort of out of context. Like whatever themes are coming up, you can't relate them to the overarching theme because you sort of lost the thread of the storyline in a way.
That's exactly right.
And when does it start? Like, what is the actual starting point for Mercury or Mars, or the moon is obvious, the new moon? What are the starting points for those other cycles?
So with the inner planets, it's the same for both of them. And there is debate, by the way, around like what really is the start. And so I'll give those examples. And then with Mars and beyond, it's the same for all of them. So for instance, you and I talked last in August of last year. Remember you came on my show? It was
Yes.
like during the Maui fires, right?
Yes.
And that was during a retrograde. It was the Venus retrograde, though, in Leo, right? Remember?
Yes.
So when Venus or Mercury go retrograde, what they're actually doing is crossing between the Earth and the Sun. So they're coming close. In fact, when any planet goes retrograde, it's coming closest to the Earth. But with the inner planets, it's passing between us and the Sun, right? And that moment of syzygy, like when the planet is conjunct the Sun, it's called cazimi, right? So it will be retrograde. This is true with Mercury and Venus. And that conjunction occurs. That is a conception moment for the entire cycle that is now opening up. Now, I'm in the camp that treats that as the beginning of the cycle, because it is like this conception moment, right? There's others, like my buddy Adam Gainsbourg, who treats the heliacal rising as the beginning. So he acknowledges the conception, but it's not until the planet is visible in the east.
Oh, this
that the
is
cycle
so
begins.
fascinating. So it's like you think of it as the cycle beginning at the conception point, and his feels like a little bit like at the birth point, like when it's actually visible, when it comes into visibility, as you can think of it as like birthing a baby too. Like he's
I was just
saying,
going to say,
Yeah.
is there a baby in you in those 9 months?
Exactly. He's saying, well, the
Yeah,
baby's not actually born until you can see it. And you're saying, no, it's actually alive and in context when it's conceived.
Yeah, it's having a prenatal experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So conception or heliacal rise, and there's even some, especially when you're considering the Mars and beyond cycles. And so this is where it gets a little confusing. When Mars is retrograde, it's not crossing in between the Earth and the Sun because it cannot do that. Right. It's the first of our neighbors, but it's an outer planet. So when it's retrograde, it is close to the Earth. That's why it's like 2.5, almost 3 times as big in the sky. It grows, it's brighter, it's intense because it's close. But the way it looks in the chart is it's opposite the Sun at its peak. And so this is, a little bit of a life hack. Like if anybody ever tells you they have a planet opposite the Sun, you automatically know that planet is retrograde. It's like a party trick. Someone's like, oh, I have Jupiter opposite the Sun. He's like, oh, you're born with Jupiter retrograde. They're like, how did you know? Crazy guess. I have an ephemeris in my head, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
But yeah, so the retrograde with Mars and beyond, it's always going to be the opposition. So that's what we're going to see on January 15th, 5 days before the inauguration, is Mars is going to peak in its retrograde. then. All right. And also the difference is that that peak, just think of it like Mars is bright. It's as what Adam calls the midnight star. And it's quite the experience. Now, there's some astrologers that say that's the beginning of the Mars cycle. And I've entertained that idea. I'm like, okay, like I'm not just going to completely discredit it. It doesn't feel like that's a beginning. It feels more like a penultimate moment or like a celebration of sorts or a battle. And over the years, it doesn't feel like a beginning to me at all. Like it indeed, like if you what I often do is overlap the monomyth, like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, with the
Yes.
Mars cycle. It works well, actually. Like you can use those stages that he talks about with the Mars journey quite well. And so like when Mars is retrograde and opposite the sun, like the whole experience is kind of like facing the enemy. It's this moment of like what is the tension in the story and how does it come to a culmination midway throughout the cycle, you know? But then there's still an entire waning part of the cycle of integration and the long return home.
And when you said that when we're working with the cycles, we're living the mythology. Is that kind of what you're referring to? Like, what do you mean by living mythology?
Ooh, you just put me in that position to kind of talk about how my favorite pet theory of how astrology works
Mm,
is I think that we are living myth, that, you know, at kind of the foundation of consciousness is mythos.
mm.
And it's one of the reasons why, bringing Joe Campbell back into it, that he realized through his life work that there's all these stories that show up all over the world, right? And that's what he kind of distilled with the Hero in a Thousand Faces and the monomyth, right? It's like, why does this show up on every continent, almost in the same way with the same features, right?
Mm.
And when you study astrology enough, right, like we have kind of, in a way, the utilitarian way of thinking how it came to us. Like, oh, we projected our own stories onto the night sky. And it's kind of like this egregore almost that occurs and it like pings back to us. And so we're having almost like this subjective hallucination, collective hallucination of any of this stuff mattering at all. But I actually believe it's reversed in this theory of mine, that I think we've actually received all of these stories because they're kind of like at the foundation. Like, you know, use the word archetype if you want, but like, you know, there's a structure to all of this, both collectively and personally. And when it comes to the planets moving around in their cycles and everything like that, like it's just these stories churning in time, right? And so if we're paying attention to them in a way, like we're getting snagged by those stories, like we are living them out, right? Like we can
Yes.
see, for example, like in a Mercury cycle every 120 days or so, that the first part of it, which we're in now, like Mercury to station direct, right? That during the retrograde, there's all these interesting interventions and tricks and folly and everything like that. But like what is actually going on is he's trying to like divert our attention from things that we really should not be paying too much attention to and then be pointing it elsewhere. And so there's a big idea that's trying to be inserted into our mind, is my opinion there. And the first phase of the cycle, we're kind of like young Hermes, where like that trickster quality is very much alive and well. Like we're so excited about this new idea. We order all the books on Amazon. We listen to all the podcasts, watch all the videos. It's all we could talk about with people. It's a lot. But then by the time Mercury leaves the morning sky and becomes an evening star, we're like, yeah, wasn't into that book. Yeah, I have an opinion about that person's podcast. Yeah, I have my own ideas now about this. I think that it's this, or you know,
Mm.
this is how I'm going to use it. And that young little Hermes turns into what we often think of as Hermes Trismegistus, like the wise sage. And so there's something that occurs. You can think about it very practically as well, that like an idea comes into us every Mercury retrograde. And if we track it and if we follow it and if we really learn from it, in our brain, what's occurring is neurogenesis. All these new synapses are firing. We're making new connections. This idea is bringing us into other places. It's changing our perception of reality. And then by the end of it, it's changed.
Mm.
Like we now have a new skill, or we've learned about a new subject. And because of that, it's in the strangest way going to help us moving forward.
Mm.
And then it resets again every 3-4 months. We get another one. And so I've become like an alien when it comes to Mercury retrogrades. Most people kind of like fear them, I suppose. They shake their fist at them. I'm like, I cannot wait even for the next one, because every single time it's wild, Amanda, what comes through. And then like I'm able to spot it. I'm like, oh, there you are, pluck you out of the air. And then I'm going to commit to this idea for the whole cycle and then see where it takes me. It's unreal how it works.
Wow. So this is just, and we're going to get to Mars retrograde, the specific one that's coming up soon, and the eclipses that we're already in eclipse season of. But what you're describing is just more intimate engagement and communion with these planetary cycles, so that, because it's probably happening within us, whether or not we're aware, right? But
Always.
then it's happening, right? Is someone that doesn't know anything about astrology, if you kind of reverse engineered, you could probably find those threads. But by being aware, it sounds to me like you can just more actively participate with it, and it comes to life even more, like you were saying before. It's more alive in you and as you. Yeah. Mm.
It augments it. And that's so true. I mean, like you don't need to have any interest in astrology whatsoever to, for example, be influenced by life cycle transits. Like when someone goes through a Saturn return, they know it. There's a maturity that happens in our late 20s, and most people are aware, whether they reference it as a Saturn return or making it past the forever 27 mark, what have you. Like, I mean, it's just everywhere. Like you see it I see it in my life all the time, listening to people. It's everywhere, right? And so, of course, those people are experiencing it, just like children. Will segue into Mars. Like when we have our first Mars return, like a sidereal return, when it comes back to where it was when we were born, which is a little bit different than the synodic cycle. That's where the whole concept of terrible twos comes from, right? And so like there as well, like a little 2-year-old is going through it because they can identify what it is that they desire, and they don't know how to hold back the tantrum that comes when you don't get it. And hopefully by 4, 6, 8, 10, we become better at that. But some 70-year-olds aren't even good at it. So
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay. And where do eclipses fall into this? Like, are eclipses part of cycles that we're also tracking that have a mythology that we can tune into?
They do. And admittedly, they are the most advanced and challenging to properly study in this way. And I think you know that because of that eclipse mastery class you did back in 2017.
Which by the way is on sale right now during eclipse season. Where
there's some good ones.
Weekend. Well, Bernadette Brady, who wrote the book on the Saros cycles,
Eagle and the Lark.
Yes, so she's one of the teachers of this class, plus some other eclipse masters who have studied eclipses their whole lives. So if you're interested in going deeper into eclipses, this class that we did, it was one of the first classes that we offered at Astrology Hub. It was like, let's just throw everybody way into the deep end. But there's many of you who are ready for that level of study. And it's just a 6-week it's a 6-class experience. It's on sale right now. I'm glad you brought it up, Adam. You didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's good. I learned a lot from it, like especially from Benjamin Dykes, because that's a whole different level. It's advanced. It's an advanced way of seeing it, but like the idea is similar, that eclipses have their rhythm as well, like the Saros cycle, 18.6 years. It even actually overlaps into macroeconomics, funny enough. But eclipses have a life cycle, right? And so just as a quick example of that, the eclipse that's happening on October 2nd, the solar eclipse in Libra, right? It will pass the very southern tip, like a lot of the eclipses lately have been in South America, right? It's like way down south that solar eclipse is. But here's like a lot of people don't know this. It's just mind bending and it's just it's symbology, right? Is that these eclipses are birthed on the poles. And so some begin on the North Pole, some begin on the South Pole. And then every 18.6 years, they repeat again and they slowly make their way to the opposite pole. And this takes over 1,000 years to happen. There's no like hard number to it, but like the eclipse that's happening on the second, I actually was just thumbing through Brady's book earlier today, figuring out what Saros it was. So she labels it a little bit different than NASA does because like they too track these things.
Mm.
And it's 8 Saros series south is the way that she labels it. And really all that means is it started on the South Pole and it's making its way up towards the equator.
Mm.
And so every 18.6 years, it's going to be a little bit further up. And then also I forget how much it moves in longitude, but like, you know, it like if you look at an animation of it, it essentially looks like a shadow serpent moving up the earth. It looks like that image of the snake
Whoa.
around the egg, you know?
Whoa. Whoa.
Yeah. And so it's no coincidence whatsoever that all cultures, like in this comparative mythology way, have a monster, usually a dragon or a serpent, eating the sun or the moon with eclipses. You know, Rahu and Ketu are the names in India. But like where I'm from in Colorado, it was a great bear. Like a lot of the Native American tribes, they had a great bear that was consuming it. Or the Vikings, it was 2 wolves that were chasing after it. Like there's all these images that are so great, but like that's, you know, embedded deeply into eclipse lore. And it's not to like it's myth, so you can't take it literally. But again, it's a gradient of consciousness that's very real, like dreams. You can't just say dreams are just like an elusive form of entertainment that we all get to have every night. Like there's obviously a function that's happening there. And if like we begin paying attention to them and then actually listening to myth and learning about myth, you start to realize that there's some overlap. And then when you throw astrology into it, it's like, get out of here. The whole thing starts to come together. You're like, this is what it is in a way. And so it takes a lifetime. I mean, that's the way I feel about it, like to gather the stories and to understand the symbols and to be able to like track all of this stuff. But yeah, back to eclipses, like, so the Saros families, like the way Brady talks about it is you want to study the chart of the original eclipse. And so the one for the 2nd of October, 8 Saros series south, I think was in 1718.
Wow.
So, you know, it's a young one actually. Like hearing that, it's like, oh wow, like this family goes on until like 2938 or something like that.
Whoa.
And so, you know, like they go on like that. And so like to study them is like, well, we've experienced, depending on our age, a few of them, or maybe only one of them, depending on how old we are. But the last one was in 2006, 18.6 years ago. Right. And so you go back to that eclipse and you're like, okay, well, where did it happen? What were the themes? You look at the base chart, you know, like there's just so much to it. It's much more complicated to study eclipses and their great trajectory within our lives than, say, a Mercury cycle, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can.
So what are the themes if we can take it from a Saros cycle perspective, but then we can also simplify it down, right? And look at the zodiac signs and look at different aspects of the eclipse, right? So what would you say are the thematic elements of this eclipse series that is happening right now in October?
So if my memory serves, I'll just take a few of the ideas I have and place them together. So I think that it started in Aries way back in 1718, like around that. Yeah, I think that's correct. And then this one happens in Libra, right? And so just meditating on that polarity and also where we're at, right? Like this happens October 2nd. It's the final eclipse of the season. And it's also 3 or 4 days before the pre shadow begins with Mars. And so all that means is Mars is going to step into the territory that he's going to be in until May, which is 17 degrees of Cancer. All right. And so back to the Aries Libra piece, it's like, okay, we already know that, at least in my experience, and I think most of us would agree, like, I have never experienced the world more polarized in my life. Like, it's like a landmine for language and words and ideas. Like, it's insane. And we can all assume that that's just going to hit a fever pitch in the coming weeks. And whoever wins the US election, I think it will continue to be a fever pitch all the way until the peak of the Mars retrograde, or the Mars cycle, right? And that's January 15th. And that's when it's opposite. So it's like Mars opposite Sun, it's retrograde. Mm-hmm. And so with the eclipse, it's like, what's the point of an eclipse anyways? And, on that, grandiose mythic idea I was talking about of how we're kind of playing out these stories and everything like that. Like the eclipse cycles are so fascinating because they are plot twists to our story. It's like we feel like we have control. We feel like we know where we're headed, or we think we know how to predict where the world is going and stuff like that. But then eclipses happen and it's like twist. It's all different. And it happens with every eclipse, in my experience. Like whatever the narrative is going into them every 6 months, there's like this subtle arrangement that occurs where on the other side of it, it's not the same anymore. And it's so clearly laid out if you just study markets. Like whatever the market sentiment is going into an eclipse season, it's going to flip and get very strange and different on the other side of it. But it's also true in our own lives. Mm. And of course, you can look to the areas of the chart. And so where we have Libra, and the first eclipse on the 18th is in Pisces, the lunar eclipse. Looking at that, what aspects it makes, all that matters. Of course it does. But
so September 18th is the Pisces eclipse.
The lunar eclipse, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. To just close the loop on that, if you're interested in that Eclipse Mastery course, we will put the link and the discount code in the show notes. So you can take advantage of that and learn from Bernadette Brady yourself and go deeper on these.
Yep. And so, like I was just mentioning, if the eclipse happens on the south node, oftentimes it's a grand old opportunity to kind of release some old stories. And wherever it falls in the chart, it is amazing to see that play out. And so we can actually think back to the fall of last year in regards to this eclipse on the 2nd. Okay. So it happens on the south node, right? Just like the Libra eclipse did last fall, if you remember that one. And to make it anecdotal, because it was very appropriate, the point of my trip to Colorado last fall was to actually get rid of everything in my storage unit. Just nice. Like to completely release all of it. And it was way more challenging than I thought it would be, just in energy and the emotions attached to a lot of it as well. Like it was heavy. But I turned in my locking key, and it wasn't fully planned like this, but like when I was done with the storage unit and everything like that, it was literally the day of that eclipse in my second house. Why does that matter? It's like the second house is where we store all our stuff.
Wow.
It's our stuff.
Wow.
8th house is other people's stuff or other people's shit. Our stuff is the second house, and I was just like dumping it all out. And there was other ways that I found that really interesting, but and still integrating it. Like if for all of you that are going to watch those eclipse classes, there's this debate with astrologers about like how long eclipses last as well, because it's not just that moment, right? Like there's some say it's for a month afterwards, some say it's until the next eclipse cycle, some say you have to like do this calculation with the duration of the totality of the eclipse, and then make it worth months and weeks, et cetera, right? So there's all these different ideas, and I think about this a lot. I have no conclusive thoughts on the matter. I just know that they ripple through time. Like they absolutely are thematic. And so when I look at this eclipse in the second, I immediately harken back to that story.
Mm.
That's quite personal, but it's also for all of us in a similar area of our chart. Like if we have a lot of Libra planets, it's another solar eclipse that's going to impact them, right? Um, and then to think about it, and because it's on the South Node, like what is it that's trying to be released and
Mm.
buried?
Mm.
Like what is that? And then the lunar eclipse is on the North Node.
Okay. All right. So, and then you referenced that this is all happening right before Mars goes into his retrograde shadow,
Yep,
right? So, how do you
I'm
see
looking at it.
this? Yeah. How do you see this storyline playing in? And tell us a little bit just in terms of the Mars retrograde, what you're seeing, why you feel this is an important transit for us all to pay attention to, based on the fact that it's Mars retrograde and the timing of everything happening in the world as well.
Right. So the reason why I wanted to pull this chart up is I just wanted to see what or how close the square was between this eclipse and Mars. Because like we've mentioned, this retrograde is going to be in Cancer and Leo. Like the retrograde starts in Leo and then it goes back into Cancer. And then the opposition happens when it's in Cancer too. And so Mars squares this eclipse is the point I wanted to make. And so it's at 15 Cancer on the day of it. And then the eclipse is at 10. So it's a bit of a wide square, but it's still a square, or a bending to the nodes. And I think it's important based on those themes, like we all know it to be true, right? And like let's now enter prickly territory and navigate it like ninjas, Amanda. That it is unbelievable to me that there are certain words that cannot be said anymore, that some people think that free speech really isn't a thing, that it's almost like a perfect mirror reflection on both sides of thinking that each is the next Hitler. Like it's kind of a stunning thing that's happening collectively at the moment. And it is extraordinarily successful at distracting us personally from what really matters.
Mm.
That there's this quote from Frank Zappa that really sums it up the best, that politics is just the entertainment branch of the industrial complex or the military industrial complex. It's something like that. It's the circus that is dangling out front from, corporate America. And boy, does it help to distract the hell out of everybody and keep us at each other's throats. And so when you think about Libra, what is the first word that comes to mind?
Cooperation, balance,
Sure. Great. Balance,
fairness.
peace.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And I think in thinking about this, it's like, well, how do we feel personally about like, do we feel balanced? Like, there's a few things that we can, assess our own situation with as we move in these eclipses. Like, do we feel balanced on just how well curated our feed is? Like, are we actually taking in calories from the opposite side from all angles? Most people aren't. Most people can't. It's impossible. The point's going back to this Libra piece, right? Like you were saying, cooperation, balance, etc. It's like, how do we do it? In my opinion, like challenging yourself to attempt to actually take in information from multiple places is huge. As with anything, take astrology. Like you listening to me talk about the Mercury cycle or the Mars cycle or the eclipses or whatever. It's like, I'm just one perspective. Watch the classes, get all those other perspectives, go on a Mercury journey. By the end of it, you're going to have your own ideas. And that's what I encourage about any of it, And so that's huge. And the only recommendation I have through that is actually trying to be genuinely curious. And one of the great things that always emerges, at least in my own life, when Mars comes close, is these opportunities to set very clear boundaries with ourselves and with those in our lives. Boundaries of steel, right? and like we'll see it, like, you know, just like a quick reflection of like the last retrogrades. It's like the summer of love into the election in 2020 was Mars retrograde. Like that was a big one. And then late fall of 22 was another one. Like that's when Elon took over X. It's when that whole SBS story happened. It's like when all the banks were failing again. It looked as if like we were going to have a great financial crisis 2.0. Pluto was going in and out of Capricorn and Aquarius, like beginning that process. Every time Mars comes close, it does heat up. But like, how strong and resilient are we, and how good of our boundaries with it? Like, that's really it, you know? And like, if we're strong with it, if we know where the line is, then we don't cross it. Like the ultimate goal, like the final thing I'll say on it, because of course there's so much, but I just want to put a cap on the Mars piece, and that it does oscillate between Cancer and Leo, right? And this Mercury cycle actually started in Leo. The Venus cycle we're in, when you and I talked last, when Maui was on fire, started in Leo. So we have both of them in these Leo cycles. And then Mars is about to kind of tease at this sign a little bit, right? The idea that came with a vengeance for me, this Mercury cycle, had everything to do with art and visual art specifically. And so I've just been doodling and noodling and just like playing around with art and like kind of in a way rescuing my inner child that used to do this all the time when I was a child, up until like 13, 14, and then it went away forever. Didn't come back until 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, right?
Wow.
And one of the most amazing insights I've had so far, just being in the process of it, because, you know, I play music, I write, I am artistic, but like there's something different around giving yourself the time and space just to kind of be present with a particular idea, and like, what is this image that I'm trying to squeeze out of my imagination? That like, it's part of the purpose of life, I feel, you know, because that's all artistic expression. It's like we feel something, we have an experience, and then we're trying to express it in some sort of a way, right? And so instead of, you know, finding yourself in the comment section, again, hard on the comment section, always have been, or, you know, just like wasting your time in that way, like you can actually do something alchemical and create, you know, like there is that divine act that is very much available to all of us. Like we don't need to be an artist or a musician to do it. It's just like, well, how is this energy moving through me, and how can I actually metamorphose it into something that doesn't even have to be useful to anyone but to yourself? Because when you see it or you hear it or whatever it is, it actually reminds you of a process that you just went through. You know, that like you came out different the other side. And I do think that is the highest expression of Leo, is to do that, but without any ownership of it. You know, not being married to your ideas, your creations, like not where it's inflating egoic ideas of oneself. No, you were just pulling spirit through you. Thank God, like you're a vessel to do that. And so like that succession in the zodiacal story is fascinating between Cancer and Leo, because that's kind of what's occurring, you know? And then like after we're like, oh, we just expressed it. Well, then Virgo comes around and we learn that the whole point is to be of service. Like, okay, that's great. You pushed it through, but now how can I help?
Adam, thank you. Thank you so much for being here on this podcast. Thank you for continuing to bring your perspective and your gifts and your wisdom and share it with our community here. I'm so grateful for you and just so happy that you're in our lives. So thank you for everything that you had to offer here today.
Well, you're welcome. I always enjoy talking with you, Amanda.
Same. Wishing you continued success. Where do they find your podcast? Where do they find you online?
So the podcast has a new name. It is now, or it's no longer Exploring Astrology. It's called Constellating Cosmos. Wherever podcasts are found, you can find that show. And I do have a Substack, like you mentioned. So I do share the podcast on there, but I also write on my Substack. Yes. And if you type in my name, I think it comes up on Google. I don't know, but it's The dragon hole is what I've named it. I don't know if you have to type that in to find it, but yeah, the dragon hole.
And he sends out, you send out a newsletter. I love reading your newsletters. And so definitely check Adam out, and can't wait to have you back in the inner circle at some point in the near future, if you'd be open to something like that. But always love have you on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a treat always.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. Thank you, as always, for making astrology a part of your life. We'll catch you on the next episode.